Real simple with respect to Ukraine. State Department, and you can see this, I think, from what everybody's seen, Ambassador Volker said on Thursday, State Department was very focused at the direction of the president. And we were very focused on creating space that we could ultimately deliver a good relationship with this new government. That was my guidance all along. It was the guidance that I took on board as we were thinking about all the various components of that relationship. You saw Ambassador Volker work diligently to try and create that opportunity. Look, we've all known there's been corruption in Ukraine. The United States government's been engaged in trying to push back against corruption in Ukraine for quite some time, and this administration's been full-fledged on, committed to that as well.
Right, there you have it. That is Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivering some new comments on Ukraine. Let's discuss with Ambassador Nancy Soderberg, former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and Deputy National Security Advisor under the Clinton administration. What's your response?
Well, good morning. I think Secretary Pompeo is not going to be able to hold up that narrative as this chaos around him swirls with new text messages and Secretary Perry resigning, and it's just an unbelievable cascade of events. And I think what's going to happen here is it will be clear that the president and Secretary Pompeo, Giuliani, the other lawyers freelancing in Europe on behalf of the president, did actually put a quid pro quo on the table. And that is a fact that will emerge through testimonies, through these text messages that have come out. And I think that the question for Secretary Pompeo is, what was his role in holding up the aid to Ukraine? It was not, as he just said, about creating space and a good relationship with Ukrainians. It was to try and make sure that this government would do the president's bidding. And that is going to come out. And I think the people around the president need to stop with these false narratives.
Do you think that in the mind of Secretary Pompeo that creating a good relationship equates doing the president's bidding?
There's always a tension when you are a cabinet member of any administration. The reason the president has political appointees is to make sure that his agenda gets sent down through the bowels of the bureaucracy. It's hard to be Secretary of State. It's hard to get the building to do what you want and to shift priorities. So that is not unusual. And I think what is unusual and why you're seeing the whistleblowers and the leaked text messages, and you're going to see more and more resignations. You have political appointees doing the president bidding in Europe, and the ambassador to the EU, for some reason, became the ambassador to Ukraine and the president's envoy. We don't really know that whole story yet either. And until the officials come clean, and this is what happened, which is very clearly the president said, we're going to hold up aid to the Ukrainians until they investigate Joe Biden. And that's clearly what happened here. And until they stop trying to hide that fact and become clear on what happened, you're just going to have this cascade of one scandal after another, and people's careers are going to be ruined, including probably the Secretary of State's.
What do you expect from the testimony coming from the ambassador coming up on Tuesday? There's been a lot of focus on what could happen there. What do you want to see?
Well, we don't know exactly what was said, but if you look at those text messages that are now out in the public domain for everyone to read, he and others were very concerned, the ambassador to Ukraine, Taylor, back and forth saying, I'm very uncomfortable with holding up military aid to Ukraine as this process goes forward. Mm-hmm. And I think all of those testimonies are going to come out. I think what the officials in this administration, as any administration, have to realize is that they work for a government that is held accountable by our courts and our Congress, and the truth always comes out. And so it's better to rip the Band-Aid off early, say what happened, and deal with the consequences of that, which may or may not cause the president to be impeached. We'll certainly find that out as that process emerges. I don't know how that's going to end, but I do know anytime you have these kind of investigations, everyone in that circle who tries to cover up exactly what happened, it never ends well for them. And I think it's important to get out what happened with this aid. Now, you remember, President Trump rightly increased aid to Ukraine. They are in a hot war with Russia. Russian troops are in Ukraine. It was the right decision to increase that aid. And who was in the chain that held that up? Why was it held up? What was conveyed as far as the reason for why it was held up? All of that is going to become part of the public record and the public reckoning of this. To the extent that they try and avoid having that story come out, it will not end well for anyone that's trying to withhold that story. And I think admit what happened, let the chips fall where they may, and then this administration can get on with the government's business.
Question for you as a former national security advisor. I know that you were probably tasked to listen to some of President Clinton's calls with foreign leaders, I imagine. And there's been a lot of focus placed on the ellipses and the notes of the president's call with his Ukrainian counterpart. How unusual is that, and how do you interpret that?
Sure. I've sat in on hundreds of phone calls in the Oval Office, traveling in the sit room with the president. And what happens is there are always other people listening on that call. Everybody's taking notes. And when the president is having a conversation with a head of state, that sets the tone for the whole government. And it filters through. You get what they call a memorandum of conversation, a MEMCOM, summarizing it. The transcripts themselves are usually not formalized. It's summaries of notes like the ones we saw released by the White House. What is unusual is to put it into a code word system that very few people have access to it. Now, there's only two reasons that one would do that. One is to actually protect very classified information, such as the identities of spies or covert programs, which raises the question of why would a president be talking about that with a foreign leader, unknown, or to try and hide what the conversation was about. So which is it here? And I think we'll find the answers to that out as well. And you also have to remember that when the president of the United States is on the phone with a foreign leader, that is a big deal for this leader. And it's clear that the Ukrainians, in these messages that are coming out, were worried about being essentially used as a political pawn by the president. They were very uncomfortable with these requests. And those conversations will be also available to the Ukrainian side. So the Ukrainians have a conversation record as well. So it is virtually impossible for a president of the United States not to have the content of these phone calls come out. And they're just making it worse by trying to obfuscate what exactly the conversation entailed. And it'll all come down to what happened to the military aid. We had almost $400 million in aid approved by the Congress, somehow held up for months, and then suddenly released when this began to become public. So what happened there? We will find that out because professional members of the bureaucracy are charged with delivering that aid, and all of a sudden it's held up. That's something that's unusual. And so that's one of the things that the Congress will go ahead and investigate. And I will just say again, don't try and obfuscate what happened. It will become public, and heads will roll if people are not telling the truth now. So the more, and it really has to come from the president himself and saying, all right, this is what happened, and I believe that I was doing the right thing. Others may disagree, but stop trying to pretend it isn't what it was, which was to link military aid to Ukraine to a request from the President of the United States.
Well, we'll see if that happens. Certainly a fair warning from a former member of a former administration. Ambassador Nancy Soderberg, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Also developing